will be like...
Yeah, it's just because of the time, I'm sorry, but we'll have discussion.
I think we'll have Q&A afterwards,
Yeah.
and I think it would be better if after Tom.
Yeah.
I think Tom has just recently published this book, and the publisher is here as well, is Carl, is also Palestinian. So, and he, in fact, he has actually written a book on Palestine as well. So, can I introduce Tom Suarez, and after that we'll have Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you everyone so much for coming tonight. I'd like quickly to thank everyone who made this meeting possible, in particular Naeem and Fatima. And I'd like quickly to thank two people without whom my book would not exist, Carl Sabotage and my partner Nancy Eland, who was my constant alter ego throughout my research, and without whom the book would not exist. Before I begin, two explanations. One, just to say that the source for everything I will say here tonight is cited in my book. Most of it is taken directly from the classified source documents in the National Archives in Kew. Two, you will hear from my lips the word Nazi in relation to Zionism. To be clear, you will only hear this when I am quoting responsible voices from the World War II period. Now, I think in contemporary discussion today, I think any such parallel is an unhelpful distraction unless there's some specific reason for it. When, however, well-informed observers in the early 1940s made such comparisons, I think we need to hear it and examine what they meant in context. Our topic is, of course, Israel-Palestine and the so-called conflict, which is, in truth, anything but a conflict. And the only reason I should be taking your time tonight is if I believe I might have something to offer toward the collective efforts to end it. And so, before I begin, I owe you an explanation of my thinking. To me, looking at the situation, what is striking above all else is how reality, truth, facts, have no effect. It is how obvious the injustice in Palestine is, and yet here we are a century after Balfour, and no degree of Israeli intransigence has ever mattered. The world stares at the never-ending theft of land, the never-ending ethnic cleansing, repression, siege, dehumanization, and racism, ongoing and relentless, and these punctuated by major terror attacks. Protective Edge, Hasled, Sabra Shatila, Kibya, to name just a few. And bear in mind that most of the victims of these were already refugees, victims of Israeli ethnic cleansing. Yet, Israel continues to spin its terror as self-defense, and we, collectively, allow our governments, for their own amoral game plans, to empower it financially, militarily, and politically. So the question becomes, before anything else, the question must be, what is at the heart of this Orwellian inversion of reality? And the answer to this, I think, begins at Israel's narrative, its creation myth. Under the messianic twilight zone of this narrative, Israel is not merely a political entity like any other nation state, but morphs into the Old Testament kingdom, whose name it adopted for that strategic purpose, striking a powerful chord in the collective Western subconscious. In order for that narrative to be inseparable from the nation state, Israel has crammed this self-identity into a three-word mantra: the Jewish state. Criticize the Israeli state, you will instead hit this three-word human shield that Israel hides behind. This self-identity is qualitatively distinct from any other country's relationship with any other religion or cultural group. Judaism is not Israel's state religion in the sense of a national faith that any nation might adopt. Rather, Israel presents itself as the Jewish state, the metaphysical embodiment and owner of Jewry itself, of Judaism, Jewish history, culture, and, of course, persecution. No country claims it is, just to pick one example, the Catholic state. Costa Rica is a Catholic state. It does not suggest that it owns Catholicism, Catholics, or historic Christian martyrdom. We do not have the British government issuing guidelines as to when criticism of the Costa Rican government becomes anti-Catholic hate speech, nor some political pressure group masquerading as a charity, smearing us in the next morning's Daily Mail. Nor does Costa Rica claim an exclusive franchise on it. Several nations maintain Catholicism as a national faith. Israel, in contrast, would never acknowledge even the possibility of another Jewish state because it has body snatched everything Jewish, holding it hostage to empower its immoral political objectives. Thus, Zionism, taken at its word, which I do not and never will, taken at its word, makes Judaism partner to its crimes. And the profound anti-Semitism of this is self-evident. Zionism was, of course, among the incarnations of racial nationalism that evolved in the late 19th century. Bigots were Zionism's avid fans. Gertrude Bell, the famous English writer, traveler, archaeologist, and spy, reported that based on her personal experience, those who supported Zionism did so because it provided a way to get rid of Jews. Theodor Herzl, the original champion of political Zionism, was horrifically anti-Semitic. His rants against traditional non-Zionist Jews make one's skin crawl. Indeed, most Jews had fought for equality and resented being told that they should now make yet another ghetto, and worse yet, to do so on other people's land. They resented being cast as a separate race of people, as Zionism demanded. They have had quite enough of that from non-Jewish bigots. The year 2017 is, of course, the centennial of the British original sin in this tragedy, the Balfour Declaration. As Fatima brings out in her film, the declaration included a mitigating phrase about no harm coming to the Palestinians. What is irrefutable in British records is that this phrase was not a naive hope, it was a lie. He and other officials involved knew that the Zionists sought to seize all of Palestine and expel non-Jews from it. Most active were Chaim Weizmann and Baron Rothschild, with Weizmann demanding that their Zionist state extend all the way to the Jordan River within 3 or 4 years of the declaration, that is by 1921, and then expand beyond it. They treated the ethnic cleansing of non-Jewish Palestinians as indispensable to their plans, and insisted that the British lie about their scheme until it is too late for anyone to do anything about it. In correspondence with Balfour, Weizmann justified his lies with racist slurs against the Palestinians and Jews, well, that is, the Middle East indigenous Jews, who were overwhelmingly opposed to Zionism and whom Weizmann smeared with classic anti-Semitic stereotypes. The Palestinians he dismissed as, in so many words, a lower type of human. And this was among the reasons he and other Zionist leaders used for refusing civil democracy in Palestine. If the Arabs had the vote, he said, it would lower the Jew down to the level of a, in his word, native. With the establishment of the British mandate, 4 decades of peaceful Palestinian resistance had proved futile, and armed Palestinian resistance, which included terrorism, began. Whereas Palestinian terrorists were loosely knit bands operating outside the villages, Zionist terror organizations operated from within the Jewish settlements and were actively empowered and shielded by those settlements and the Jewish agency, the recognized semi-autonomous government of the settlements, what would become the Israeli government. These Zionist terror organizations attacked anyone in the way of their messianic goals, Palestinian, Jew, or British. And there was no substantive difference between the acknowledged terror organizations, most famously the Irgun and Lehi, the so-called Stern Gang, and the Jewish agency and its terror organization, the Haganah. The agency cooperated, collaborated, and even helped finance the Irgun. The Irgun in particular would act on behalf of the Haganah so that the Jewish agency could feign innocence. Both US and British intelligence described Zionism as fascist in nature. The Jewish agency tolerated little dissent and sought to dictate the fates of all Jews. The indoctrination of children was vital to the Zionist project, and the extremism of this came to public light on the 8th of July, 1938. That day, the Irgun blew up a bus filled with Palestinian villagers. Now, this was not the first time the Irgun had done something of this sort, but this time the British caught the bomber. She was a 12-year-old schoolgirl. Teenagers, both boys and girls, were commonly used to plant bombs in Palestinian markets and conduct other terror attacks. Teachers were threatened or removed if they tried to intervene in the indoctrination of their students, and the students themselves were blocked from advancement if they resisted. some even being taught to betray their own parents if those parents tried to instill some moderation. Jews who opposed and tried to warn of the emerging fascism were assassinated, and indeed most victims of Zionist assassination, that is, targeted rather than indiscriminate, were Jews. From the beginning of World War II through to the summer of 1947, that is right before the partition resolution, there were virtually no Palestinian attacks, even though Zionist terror against Palestinians continued. A British explanation for the Palestinians' refusal to respond in kind to this terror was that they understood that the attacks were a trap, intended to elicit a response that the Zionists would then frame as an attack against which they would have to, quote-unquote, defend themselves. Sound familiar? Indeed, this was a Zionist tactic alluded to by the British as early as 1918, and it, of course, remains Israel's default strategy today. To be treated as most secret is the red ink heading of a transcript of a key meeting of 20 people held in London on the 9th of September, 1941. I will cite from this meeting because it shows the explicit plans of key Zionist leaders, and because it is almost exactly midway between the Balfour Declaration and the 1967 enlargement of the 1948 occupation of land beyond the 1947 partition. President Or Weizmann, who had called the meeting, David Ben-Gurion, and other Zionist leaders such as Simon Marx of Marks and Spencer, and the prominent non-Zionist industrialist Robert Whaley Cohen. There is no ambiguity. The takeover and ethnic cleansing of all of Palestine did not just happen. It had always been the plan, the absolute goal. Discussing the path to the proposed so-called Jewish state, the meeting ran along the lines of George Orwell's still-to-be-published Animal Farm. Anthony the Rothschild began by stressing that there would be, quote, no discrimination against any group of its citizens in the Jewish state, not even, quote, to meet immediate needs. Weizmann and Ben-Gurion also assured the skeptics, Arabs, Palestinians, would have equal rights. However, they clarified that within that absolute equality for everybody, Jewish settlers would have to have special privileges. Weizmann's quote-unquote absolute equality included the transfer of most non-Jews out of Palestine, while permitting, quote, a certain percentage of Arab and other elements, end quote, to remain in his Jewish state, the insinuation being as a pool of cheap labor. Anthony the Rothschild's vision of equality and non-discrimination was equally compelling. It, quote, depended on turning an Arab majority into a minority. And to achieve this, there would be, quote, no equal rights for non-Jews. Cohen, the industrialist, found the scheme terrifying, submitting that the Zionists were, quote, starting with the kinds of aims with which Hitler had started. Cohen did not stop there. He suggested that if a state with equality for everyone were indeed intended, the state should be named with a neutral geographic term. He suggested Palestine. The others were horrified at this idea, arguing that if the state did not have a Jewish name, quote, they would never get a Jewish majority, acknowledging the use of messianic fundamentalism as a calculated political strategy. In another obvious but never publicly spoken admission, Ben-Gurion clarified that his Jewish state was not based on Judaism. It was rather based on Jews as a race, which until Zionism had been classic anti-Semitism. Asked about the borders of his settler state, Weizmann continued in the same surreal manner. He replied that he would consider the partition plan put forth by the Peel Commission 4 years earlier in 1937, but that the line, the partition, would be the Jordan. Now, this was nonsensical. The Jordan was the eastern boundary for both states. So Weizmann partition meant 100% for the Zionist state and 0% for the Palestinians. And he went further. He would, quote, very much like to cross the Jordan, that is, take Transjordan along with Palestine. At the end of the meeting, Weizmann sought to put his proposals into effect officially in the name of all Jews. Those against his proposals were, in his word, yes, anti-Semites. Meanwhile, World War II was raging. What was the Jewish Agency's reaction to the most terrible enemy Jewry has ever known? From the beginning, it was to lobby the Yishuv, the Jewish settlers, not to enlist in the Allied struggle against the Nazis, because doing so would not serve Zionism. Even taking advantage of May Day, 1940, about half a year into the war, to lecture the Yishuv to stay in Palestine rather than join the effort against the Nazis. Another reaction of the Jewish agency was to conduct a massive theft ring of Allied weapons and munitions, as if, to quote one British military record, paid by Hitler himself. Much has been written on the collaboration between the Zionists and the fascists during the war, the best known, of course, being the Havara Transfer Agreement that broke the anti-Nazi boycott. One of the least known was Leahy's attempted collaboration with the Italian fascists. In its nearly concluded so-called Jerusalem Agreement of late 1940, Leahy would help the fascists win the war, and in return, the fascists would then use their military power to destroy any Jewish communities not in Palestine, which was most of them, and force their populations to Palestine. If this sounds like a scheme so extreme that only fanatical Leahy could have conjured it, it is essentially what the Israeli state ultimately succeeded at in the early 1950s. Most catastrophically, when it conducted a false flag terror campaign against Jews in Iraq to destroy that ancient community and move its population to Israel as ethnic fodder. German Jewish immigrants to Palestine during the war were outraged by the Zionists' cynical exploitation of the Nazi horrors they had just fled. This outrage was given voice by, among others, the prominent journalist Robert Welch, who had been editor of a Berlin newspaper until that paper was banned by the Nazis in 1938. Welch warned that Zionist leaders, quote, have not yet understood that the enemy seeks the destruction of the Jews. We, who have been here only a few years, we know what Nazism is. Zionists rather are, quote, taking part in the crashing of European Jewry only as spectators. Now I paraphrase, fighting the British and keeping Jews from joining the Allied struggle while getting comfortable and rich from their political project in Palestine. Recent immigrants from Germany and Central Europe, he said, have no representation among the Zionist ruling establishment. If they did, quote, we would have demanded that the Yishuv should put itself at the disposal of Britain for the fight against Hitler and Nazism. But, and I am still quoting Robert Welch, they, the Zionists, do not want to fight against Hitler because his fascist methods are also theirs. They do not want our young men to join the forces, the Allied forces. Day after day, they are sabotaging the English war effort. These German Jewish immigrants were shunned by the Zionists, their publications and presses bombed. Even kiosks were bombed by the Zionists for selling non-Hebrew papers to German Jewish immigrants. In 1943, a man whom British records describe as, quote, a Jew whose integrity is not open to question, risked his life to warn about the threat of Zionism. For his safety, he was referred to only by the code name Z. Z described Zionism as a parallel movement to Nazism. He warned that the Zionist indoctrination of youth was producing a society of extremists who will use any method necessary to achieve Zionist goals. And he pointed out that as fascism in Europe has demonstrated, such a society is very difficult to undo once it has taken root. And the result, I'm afraid, is what we, or more accurately the Palestinians, are facing today in this so-called conflict. How trustworthy is this anonymous testimony? I found at the National Archives a private letter in which Z is identified. He was J.S. Bentridge, the senior inspector of Jewish schools in Palestine. Zionists, quote, would have got further toward rescuing the unfortunates in Axis Europe had they not complicated the question by always dragging Palestine into the picture. So judged a report by U.S. intelligence in the Middle East, dated the 4th of June, 1943, entitled Latest Aspects of the Palestine Zionist Arab Problem. And note that it is not described as a Jewish Arab problem, but a Zionist one. The U.S. report described Zionism in Palestine as, quote, a type of nationalism which in any other country would be stigmatized as retrograde Nazism, and stated that anti-Semitism was essential to it. Whereas, quote, assimilated Jews in Europe and America are noted for being stout opponents of racialism and discrimination, Zionism has spread the opposite mentality, quote, a spirit closely akin to Nazism, namely an attempt to regiment the community, even by force, and to resort to force to get what they want. The report refuted Zionist propaganda about having made the desert bloom. It noted the irony that it was from the Palestinians that the settlers learned, among other things, the cultivation of Jaffa oranges. And whereas the Palestinians were self-sufficient, the Zionist settlements exist on massive external financing. And should the settlements ever have to survive on their own merits, as the Palestinians do, quote, the venture will collapse like a pricked balloon. The conclusion of this early U.S. intelligence report was, however, it was naive, or at least it was premature. Now that the world, quote, has seen the lengths to which the Nazi creed has carried the nations, it reasoned that the Zionists, quote, are due to find themselves an anachronism. Unfailingly, Jewish suffering served the Zionist project, not the other way around. In fact, the single most deadly terror attack of the entire mandate period was not the bombing of the King David Hotel in 1946, as is commonly thought. Even some of the Irgun's bombings of Palestinian markets killed more people than the King David attack. But the single most deadly attack of the entire mandate period was the Jewish agency's bombing of the immigrant ship Patria in 1940, killing an estimated 267 people, most of whom were Jews fleeing the Nazis. The Jewish agency bombed the Patria because it was bringing the DPs to Mauritius, where the British had facilities for them. Now, the Zionist version of history is that the Jewish agency meant only to disable the ship. But this is an absurd argument. When you blow up a ship, you cannot then say that you didn't mean to hurt anybody. The fact is that the agency placed its need for ethnically correct settlers above the lives of the people in order to get the survivors to remain, which indeed they did. In further violence against its Jewish victims, the agency exploited them for propaganda. It spread the lie that the DPs themselves blew up the vessel, that they committed mass suicide because they could not bear not to go directly to Palestine, posthumously exploiting the dead to serve the Zionist myth. This, by the way, was not the only immigrant ship that the Jewish agency bombed for its own political reasons. Another form of Zionist violence against Jews was the sabotaging of safe havens in order to force them to Palestine. For example, in early 1944, President Roosevelt succeeded in principle in establishing 500,000 new homes for European DPs, displaced people. Most of these homes in the United States and Britain. U.S. Zionist leaders were outraged at this and sabotaged it. When Roosevelt's aide, Morris Ernst, confronted U.S. Zionist leaders in an attempt to save the program, he was, in his words, thrown out of parlors and accused of treason. Treason because he was Jewish and the Zionists claimed to own Jews. To be sure, I am not saying that the international community was welcoming to European Jews. They were not. The issue, rather, is that the Zionist movement as a whole used its considerable influence to keep the doors shut, not to open them. Nor were those already settled safe. In 1946, the Ashkenazi chief rabbi of Palestine, Yitzhak Herzog, conducted a massive kidnapping operation of orphans of Jewish background that had been adopted by European families when their parents perished years earlier. Removing 10,000 children from their homes was the number he cited to the New York Times as his goal. In the National Archives, I found a copy of his own record of the trip. Herzog complains of the fierce resistance he met from horrified local Jewish leaders who tried to protect the children, but he used his political clout to circumvent them. In France, for example, facing the steadfast refusal of the Jewish leaders to betray the children, Herzog, and I quote from his log, met the Prime Minister of France, from whom I demanded promulgation of a law which would oblige every family to declare the particulars of the children it houses. Now I paraphrase, so that those of Jewish background could be exposed and put back in orphanages until they can be shipped to Palestine. Quite a Kafkaesque twist on Passover for these children who had just been spared the Nazis. Herzog's justification for the kidnappings was that for a child of Jewish background to be raised in a non-Jewish home is, quote, much worse than physical murder. Yet even this bizarre justification fails to explain what was actually taking place, because at the same time Herzog was rescuing Jewish orphans from this fate much worse than physical murder, his Jewish agency colleagues were sabotaging Jewish adoptive homes in England for young survivors still in the camps. The real reason for all of it, of course, was that the children were needed to serve the Stedler Project as demographic fodder. To that end, the Jewish agency had coerced President Truman to segregate Jewish DPs into Zionist indoctrination camps, despite objections even from fiercely pro-Zionist Churchill that it echoed Nazi behavior. The camps nurtured such fanaticism that it shocked a joint US-UK committee that visited the camps in 1946. Before these segregated camps, few DPs wanted to go to Palestine, as far as we know. But now the committee found them in a delirious state, threatening mass suicide if they did not go to Palestine. Suggestions of new homes in the United States, which had always been the favored destination, were again met with threats of mass suicide. DPs were also groomed to bring Zionist terrorism to Europe, bombing Allied trains and Allied facilities. The bombing of the British embassy in Rome in 1946, for example, was by DPs brainwashed in these camps, as was a near catastrophe in the Austrian Alps in 1947, when DPs nearly blew an Allied train off a steep trestle into a deep abyss, which would almost certainly have sent its 200 civilians and Allied troops to their deaths. After the war, the Jewish agency discussed its enemies. Its enemies were democracy, the Atlantic Charter, which of course became the basis for the United Nations, Reconstruction, and the fall in anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism having always been Zionism's drug, without which it would be irrelevant. The agency sought to exploit anti-Semitism and blamed declining anti-Semitism in the United States on America's so-called, quote, democratic attitude. And to be sure, I am quoting source documents held by the National Archives detailing Jewish agency meetings. As Henry Hunlow, who was the defense security officer in Palestine, reported, it was important for the Jewish agency to, quote, stir up anti-Semitism in order to force Jews to come to Palestine. Now, today, when anything approaching this topic is raised, it is twisted by some into the pejorative misstatement that the speaker, in this case me, is blaming Jews for anti-Semitism. No, rather it is the fact that Zionism requires anti-Semitism and seeks to ensure that it, or at least the appearance of it, never ends, and this at the expense of Jews. I also mentioned Reconstruction. As one former settlement member, a man named Newton, explained, Zionist leaders were afraid that with the improvement of conditions in Europe, the pressure on Palestine would subside. Any improvement in Europe was an anathema to their plans. And indeed, Ben-Gurion initiated a policy of non-cooperation with Reconstruction even before the war ended. By 1946, Zionist terrorism had become the defining daily challenge of life in Palestine, and 100,000 British troops proved unable to contain it. Anyone or anything that kept Palestine a functioning society was a target of the Zionists. Trains, roads, bridges, communications, oil facilities, and Coast Guard stations were constantly being bombed. Utility workers, telephone repairmen, railway workers, bomb disposal personnel were murdered. Police were long a favored target and were gunned down by the dozens. Among the smaller terror organizations that popped up was one specifically dedicated to the Zionists' long-running fear of Jews befriending non-Jews. The ultimate fear, of course, being polluting what for the Zionists was the pure Jewish race. As a sample of its methods, the terror group is said to have doused a disobedient Jewish girl with acid, severely injuring her and blinding her in one eye. Zionist terror was aided by the Jewish agency's phenomenal intelligence network. The agency had informers all the way to high-placed sympathetic US officials that fed them intelligence such that the British learned not even to trust direct messages to US President Truman. When the UN's Palestine Committee, UNSCA, visited Palestine in the summer of 1947, the agency had already replaced the committee members' drivers with spies, had already replaced the waiters at the main restaurant they frequented with spies, and most productively sent 5 young women to serve at what they called a theater network of house attendants at the building where the members, all men, were being housed. The young women were required to be smart and educated, but above all, in the agency's word, to be daring. Whatever daring meant, they succeeded in extracting a wealth of information from the key people who were deliberating Palestine's future. Jewish sex workers were involuntarily recruited as spies. They were told that upon the Zionist victory, they would be executed for sleeping with the enemy. But they might be spared if they cooperated now. The practice was so widespread that a standard questionnaire was printed up that the women were to fill out after each British customer. Illustrative of the degree to which Jewish agency plans infiltrated the government and everyday life, a couple of months after one Coast Guard station was attacked and bombed by the Haganah, it blew up again. But the British were baffled because this time there had been no attack. They discovered that the construction crew that had rebuilt the station after the previous attack were Haganah and had simply embedded explosives in the reconstruction. But the worst problem of infiltration was in the military service, where deadly sabotage by Zionist plants who had joined the forces led, tragically, to orders to remove all Jews from service in Palestine because there was no way to tell the Zionists from the Jews. By 1948, this problem spread to key medical personnel. After the Jewish agency poisoned the water supply of Akkar with typhoid in order to expedite the ethnic cleansing of the city, which of course lies on the Palestinian side of partition, not the Zionist side. The bacteriologist hired by the British proved to be a Haganah plant or sympathizer, and proved to be an obstacle to the availability of the vaccine. Selling terror required effective marketing, and for this as well, the agency exploited the plight of European Jews. A clear example of this is the iconic Zionist immigrant story, the USS Warfield, which of course was renamed the Exodus for the obvious biblical iconography. The Exodus was sold to the world as the desperate attempt of 4,515 Holocaust survivors to reach their last hope of safety and a new life, their promised life. The British instead forced them back not just to Europe, but to their ultimate nightmare, Germany. Well, that was the story the US and European public got. In truth, the Exodus was a cynical propaganda event. It was grand theater, not for the benefit, but at the expense of Jewish survivors. The Jewish agency knew the Exodus passengers would be turned back, for among other reasons, the agency's flooding of Palestine with settlers was a tactic to force its political goals. And remember that the entire Exodus cargo of immigrants equaled less than 1% of President Roosevelt's resettlement plan that the Zionists sabotaged. The DPs themselves were products of the Zionist camps and had been rehearsed to repeat, as one witness described it, whatever Zionist mumbo-jumbo was demanded of them. As for the return to Germany, it was the Jewish agency, not the British, that forced the DPs back to Germany. Attempts were being made to find new homes for the Exodus passengers elsewhere. Denmark was one possibility, but this was sabotaged by Ben-Gurion because it would spoil the Exodus show. There was, in fact, already an alternative to Germany. All the Exodus DPs already had the right to disembark in southern France. Maybe not ideal, but for most of them, it would have been far preferable than going all the way around to Germany. But the agency used violence to prevent them from leaving, despite British attempts to circumvent that. The Exodus show required the pathetic spectacle of their forced return to Germany. I will paraphrase the Israeli professor Edith Zertal, who commented that the greater the suffering of these survivors of the Holocaust, the greater their political and media effectiveness for the Zionists. A few months after the Exodus, the UN recommended partition with the assumption that a Zionist state would follow. Resolution 181 was directly influenced by the certainty of continuing Zionist terror if this did not happen, as was the disproportionately large land area that the UN gave the Zionists. According to British cabinet papers, giving the Zionists so much land up front was an attempt to delay, not prevent, but delay the Zionist expansionist wars they knew would come. This appeasement, of course, failed. Within a few months of Resolution 181, the Zionist armies were already waging their first expansionist war, confiscating more than half of the Palestinian side of partition. But the fact that the British were occupying Palestine enabled Zionist leaders to juxtapose their terror campaign as a liberation movement against British colonizers, and thus for their ethnic cleansing to be spun instead as a war of independence or emancipation. This so-called War of Independence was in truth, I'm almost done, shall I keep going?
Yeah. No, I think another couple of minutes.
Yes, I'm almost done. Was in truth, to quote the British High Commissioner at the time, operations based on the murdering of terrified women and children. Its broadcast, boasting of their successes, quote, both in content and in manner of delivery, are remarkably like those of Nazi Germany. The Zionists were, quote, jubilant with their campaign of calculated aggression coupled with brutality. British intelligence, meanwhile, reported that the internal machinery of the Jewish state and all the equipment of a totalitarian regime is complete, including a custodian of enemy property to handle Arab lands. In the Yishuv itself, persecution of Christian Jews, which I assume they meant converts, and others who offend against national discipline has shown a marked increase and in some cases has reached medieval standards. All this, to be sure, was before any Arab resistance. Finally, on the 15th of May, 1948, Britain fled the scene of its crime, for which the Palestinians have been paying ever since. There is the sense that the situation calmed and became static after 1948. This is false. The ethnic cleansing and terror attacks continued post-statehood, evolving with the new dynamics. Israel now holding up the untenable catastrophe it had created and refused to rectify as the existential threat against which it now had to, quote-unquote, defend itself. 100 years ago, MP Edwin Montagu accused the British government of anti-Semitism for colluding with the Zionists in the Balfour Declaration. History has, to say the least, proven him correct. The historical record makes plain what should already be obvious from the present reality, that the self-identity Zionism and Israel accorded themselves is a fraud. Indeed, they are the cynical, deadly exploitation of Judaism, anti-Semitism, and Jewish persecution. Exposing this, in my opinion, is the conflict's Achilles heel. But as matters stand, every time the child points out that the emperor is naked, he or she is smeared as an anti-Semite and silenced. Today, the IHRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, promotes a definition of anti-Semitism that is engineered to empower a nation-state's ethnic crimes. What greater betrayal of the memories of the Nazis' victims? Similarly, the self-proclaimed campaign against anti-Semitism instead exploits the smear of anti-Semitism on behalf of a pariah state. This is anti-Semitic, and it must finally be confronted and challenged. There are calls for the British government to apologize for the Balfour Declaration. But the word apologize suggests a wrongdoing that is in the past. British policy, no matter who is in power, has been a never-ending Balfour Declaration. First, we need to get Britain to end the ongoing Balfour Declaration. Then, yes, it must apologize. After a century, we have the British government actually repressing its own citizens on behalf of this foreign pariah state. The prerequisite to justice and peace, in my opinion, is to deprive Israel of its smoke and mirrors. And that, in my opinion, begins in the historical record. Thank you, Einar.